the Federal Reserve Bank. The Wall Street Journal earlier this month, quote, Federal Reserve officials are seriously considering dropping an assurance that short-term interest rates will stay near zero for, quote, a considerable time. These are the two magical words that the Fed has been using again and again in recent months. They'll keep the rates near zero for a considerable time, and now they're thinking about dropping that phrase as they look more confidently toward rate increases around the middle of next year. Question one, since the financial crisis of 2008, how has the Fed served us?
Badly. By keeping the interest rates low, they're, for example, depriving a whole generation of a decent return on money that they saved, which would normally go into the marketplace and earn them a decent rate of interest. But now the Federal Reserve is keeping the interest rate low, and so they won't get it.
And that's unfair primarily to older people.
That's true, but it's more than unfair. It's a bad allocation of resources. If someone wants to set up a business and is willing to pay 5% for money to do that, and the government comes in and follows a policy that brings it down to virtually zero, then the investments will not go where they would have gone ordinarily in a free market.
So they're messing around with a whole system of price signals, and who knows the misallocations that are taking place.
Yes.
All right. The counter argument, though, Tom, is that in 2008 we had a very serious crisis. It was a shock to the financial system and the whole economy. And legislation was enacted requiring of the Federal Reserve not only price stability, but to do what it could to encourage maximum possible employment. And so the Fed is saying we just have to have easy money because even let us grant that Dr. Sowell was right, that the government is largely responsible for the mess in the first place by monkeying around in the house. Grant it all. People are out of work. Ordinary Americans are hurting. We, the Fed, have to keep money easy in this economy to keep the economy at least sputtering along so more ordinary people don't hurt worse.
It sounds good.
Thank you.
It's only if you look at history that there's a problem. For example, there's a book out which is called The Forgotten Depression. I haven't read it, but I know what it's about. And so now when Warren Harding takes office...
This is James Grant's new book, right?
I think so.
Okay. Right.
When Warren G. Harding takes the office of president in 1921, unemployment was something like 12%.
Pretty bad.
Yes. Harding did absolutely nothing except cut back government spending because there were less taxes coming in, so he cuts back the spending. Now, obviously, the Keynesians would say, "Oh my God, what is wrong with the man?"
Right.
The following year, the unemployment rate was around 6%, and the year after that, it was around 4%. And Harding did absolutely nothing again. So when people say things like the government has to do something, I say, have you ever studied what happens when the government does something compared to what happens when they don't do anything? And for 150 years, the government of the United States did nothing when there was a depression. No depression during all those 150 years was ever as bad as the Great Depression of the 1930s, in which the government did more than it had ever done before in its entire history, under both Hoover and Roosevelt.
You know, we've never had this discussion, but what caused, all these years later, the Great Depression is still used as the implicit, and sometimes the argument gets made explicitly, but it's lying at the bottom of all these economic debates, even now.
Yes.
You contend against everything children learn from kindergarten on about the benevolence of Franklin Roosevelt. Mm-hmm. You contend that we would have been better off if what?
Well, it's not even a question of if, it's a question of when. You see, the stock market crash occurred in October 1929.
Right.
2 months later, unemployment peaked at 9%. And then it started declining. And by June of 1930, it was down to 6.3%. That was when the first government intervention took place. And within 6 months, it was in double digits. And it stayed in double digits for the entire decade of the 1930s.
So if we had, I'm stumbling here because I'm making up this mental experiment as I go, if we had Calvin Coolidge,
oh yes,
4 terms in a row instead of Franklin Roosevelt, and Calvin Coolidge, who was reticent in every way, including reticent to have the federal government do anything.
Yes.
He was a Warren Harding had certain moral failings, I think. Calvin Coolidge was Warren Harding with personal rectitude.
Yes.
The country would have been better off?
Absolutely. And more than that, Harding, after all, was eligible to run for office again. Remember, his famous thing was, "I do not choose to run."
Coolidge said, right.
Yeah.
Harding died, and then Coolidge became president. Right,
Yes.
right.
And then he won presidency in his own right. But he had only served one term in his own right. And they were expecting him to run again at 28, and he decided not to. If he'd stayed on, I'm sure he would never have done what Hoover did.